Well, here we are. I'm excited to say that we are about 2 weeks out from seeing each other in Miami for phase 2. And in preparation for that, we've invited Ana, who's primary founder on the fellowship, and Maria, one of your colleagues from the fellowship, to have a conversation, right, on environmental justice. Our goal is to have a couple of videos, one on environmental justice and one on just transition, to form kind of the closing of phase 1, the frameworks that we have all been invited to grapple with as we begin to move from the problem to the solution, or the how might we phase. So I just want to thank you, Ana, so much for being on here, and Maria, for being a colleague. And our hope is this is a conversation, but it's also a real fundamental stepping stone into phase 2. So for some of you, this might be knowledge that you know and wisdom that you've grown and contribute to for the movement. And for others, this might be the very first time that you'll hear some of these terms. And so the invitation is to be in an open stance and to receive some of this, and we can continue to talk about it within your core groups when you meet every month. And we can also bring some of this into the way that we open up phase 2 on our first day of work together, where we move from the extractive into the regenerative space, if we want to use the just transition language. So for today, our purpose is to provide this grounding, to have a bit of a conversation, and to go from light EJ theory to some of the grounding, different frameworks that informed environmental justice, to be able to talk about environmental racism and the intersections of environmental racism with the movement today. And then finally, transition into a conversation, a light conversation of some of the models of just transition. And we'll pick up on video 2 on a deeper conversation where Jesus and Jesus from the Jotas, talk about just transition from a food sovereignty framework, which is where he works in. Again, if you have questions that come up, this recording is meant to stimulate rich conversation and dialogue, knowing that movements are called movements because they're always shifting and changing. And with that, I think we'll start off. We have a very comprehensive PowerPoint that you probably all have access to, but we're going to kind of move around. And what I really get inspired with the way that, Ana, you've framed this is you talk about the EJ movement tributaries.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. I'm going to do my best to get through some of these slides, but welcome. It is really an open invitation to interpret, contest, and build on the framings in these PowerPoint slides. I use a lot of these with my students in EJ classes. So for them, it's also an introduction to sort of the theory and history and practice. And often, when students are being introduced to the environmental justice movement, they think of it as a moment in time, this linear timeline where, oh, the Warren County, North Carolina moment and back in the 1980s is when the term was born and the movement was born. But in reality, that's actually not how movements are born, right? They're not born in one singular moment in time. But we talk about them like tributaries, right? There are many, many tributaries that feed a river that come from very many rich traditions of movements, social movements, the civil rights movement, farm workers, indigenous struggles, global South struggles. So there are many different movements that feed the EJ movement, and there are hundreds of years of tradition that have built the movement that we identify today as the environmental justice movement. And it's a very rich and diverse movement. So it's, we often talk about it also in a very US-based context, but, and there's a lot of great rich history in the US around the term environmental justice and environmental justice movement, but we borrow and we feed from lots of different places around the world. So But you'll see this slideshow does reference a lot of US-based movement markers. So again, it's an invitation to open up that storytelling about where the movement traditions come from. And we often think about like defining environmental justice. And I find myself doing this. I often define it by what it's not, right? I define like communities that are poisoned and polluted and are created as sacrifice zones, but that's environmental racism or environmental injustice. The environmental justice definition is very broad, and sometimes it's harder to define because it encompasses so many things. I love Bunyan Bryant's definition from back in the early 2000s. He was at University of Michigan, and he talked about broad cultural norms and people realizing their highest potential, democratic decision making. You know, Bunyan was really trying, Professor Bryant was really trying to open up environmental justice to mean not just a redistribution of goods and bads, but like really challenging material inequality, misrecognition, you know, power relations that deny people not only meaningful participation, but dignity and freedom from oppression and full liberation. And that's, you know, environmental justice encompasses all of that. And the EPA definition is really, I hate to even bring it up because I feel like it's just too narrow and very regulatory, but that's often what gets regurgitated a lot as an environmental justice definition. And you could see how narrow it seems in comparison to the ambition of the broader definitions. So I keep going here. And I think just to break it down a little bit more from a, I would say like a theory perspective, like thinking about what's the justice in environmental justice. And often we think about, the first thing we think about with justice is distributive justice, like the distribution of the things in society we want more of or less of, right? The goods and bads, and who gets to define what's a burden, a benefit even among communities is important. But when we talk about, for example, pollution and cumulative impacts, a lot of the times that's like a distributive form of justice that we're talking about. And then procedural justice, I think lots of us know well, or we think about a lot, which is not only access to decision-making processes, but the power of decision-making, right? Like who actually holds the power to impact the conditions of distribution, right? Like who has a voice, who has a say, and then under what conditions, how much agency do people have and communities have. And then there's like a harder to define form of justice, which is this idea of recognition, you know, the freedom in a society to be free of oppression, but also to be fully recognized as and treated with dignity in a society, both as an individual, but as a community too. And that's a very important part of achieving justice. You know, you can't actually have procedural or distributive justice if you're not seen as, you know, fully recognized in a society, right? And then there often folks talk about structural justice with sort of the type of structures in our society, political and economic conditions that structure the possibilities for different kinds of decision-making, different kinds of access to power. And that's a harder, it's a less tangible thing to kind of figure out, like, what does that look like? But when you think about the institutions in our society, it's important to see how power is embedded in those institutions and how they move different forms of justice and for whom. So hopefully, I think that kind of breaks down a little bit about the theory. Now let's see. And this is just a little bit about the tributaries, right? When we think about tributaries, and this is a tapestry that we can do many, many slides on and many stories on. So this is just literally a little snapshot of some of the tributaries that feed the river. And that analogy comes from, you know, Luke Cole and Sheila Foster's book From the Ground Up, where they wrote this beautiful book about some of these tributaries including, civil rights, obviously, the labor movement, the Native and Indigenous struggles, anti-toxics. Now I have they had, and Luke Cole and Sheila Foster included environmentalism in this tributary that contributed, but that's very contested, right? Like, and my students, I had a student write to me, she said, my first class, when you told me environmental justice activists don't consider themselves environmentalists, they actually reject that term. They were shocked by that. That was the first time that they had considered that. And that's because the types of environmentalism and the forms and expressions of the environmental movement in the US, in the Western context, really did not, it was actually in many cases in opposition to some of the social justice movements and the movements, the other tributaries that are feeding this river here. So in many cases, many people would say environmentalism actually falls outside this river, that maybe it was like a parallel river that like maybe had a few streams that linked up with it at different times or points, but was not a main tributary into the EJ River.
Maria, can I ask you here, do you see yourself in any of these? Like, where do you see Ironbound? And both of you obviously have this beautiful, rich history with the Ironbound community. Where do you see yourself here or somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I think about Newark, and around the time when ICC was born was actually right after the Newark Rebellion, right? Which is obviously the direct tie into the civil rights movement. It was when the National Guard came into Newark. Right after that's actually when ICC is born. And thinking about the anti-toxics movement, I think about the, Anna, what everybody talks about, right? Like the explosions in warehouses, the illegal dumping that was happening, the Agent Orange production in Ironbound. Labor movement, not so much, but now we're touching on it a lot more with warehouse workers and Amazon. And with environmentalism, like personally, I feel a deep rejection of everything environmentalism stands for, because environmentalism separates the person from the, from the world, really, as if the world's something separate to be protected, like I think about it, like you're watching the globe and you can hold it in your hand, right? That's like, that's, you can conserve things you own. And I don't feel that way about my relationship to the world I live in.
Yeah, I think it's a good segue into this this one where we talk about 1991, right?
Yeah, this is sort of like a little bit of a cheat sheet for my students who are just starting out and like trying to understand and make sense of all these different movements, especially, nowadays there's so many intersectional movements, right? That students are like, when I ask them, do you consider yourself part of a movement? And oftentimes it's difficult for them to articulate what movement, right? Because there's so many of them intersect. But many of the activists that identify with the EJ movement or have in the past had some shared experiences or worldviews around having a sort of very tangible material concern about survival and health and well-being that's tied to pollution, right? Health and well-being of their children and their communities, right? So very tangible ways that they felt in their everyday lives the impacts of the environment, quote unquote, right? Pollution, right? And many of the groups and the people that formed the heart of the EJ movement were people who were directly impacted themselves and living in those communities day in or working in those communities that were affected, but also, and many times in a society, were disenfranchised by society, whether politically or culturally or socially. And so they were finding solutions outside of the mainstream or the state purported solutions. You think about the civil rights movement or, movements that sought liberation that, didn't seek out those solutions from the state because they had lived the reality of being abandoned by the state, by the systems that were supposedly the social safety net that didn't apply to them, right? So they freed themselves of this liberal illusion. They knew that the state wasn't going to come save them. And in fact, that was a key marker of the difference between like the experience of Native people or Black, people in this country, and when they confronted pollution and environmental racism, they had very different expectations than poor whites in the anti-toxics movement. And Lois Gibbs was shocked when the government was doing nothing to help her community clean up when they had all this gook coming into their basements, because it was a working class realization of whites that they're actually disenfranchised as well, that they had this expectation that of something, whereas a lot of Black and Indigenous communities didn't have that expectation. They were seeking solutions outside of the state because they knew that the state wasn't going to come in and save them necessarily. So this is a different tradition. So we talk about the tributaries. There's many rich movements in the global South of resistance, liberation, dealing with material inequality and cultural misrecognition and sovereignty. This thesis called The Environmentalism of the Poor was born out of the 1990s and in the 2000s. And a lot of people have actually contested the term environmentalism of the poor, because people in the global South are like, we're actually not the poor. Putting this moniker on us as poor. They don't see themselves necessarily as poor. They see themselves as very rich in terms of their access to resource, culture, and sovereignty. So, but the little table here is a way to condense very complex ideas and theories, sort of different schools of thought or framings, right? Some people might call it a theory of change or a theory. And it's an oversimplification. So forgive the oversimplification, but it's just for learning purposes, particularly for students who are new. So when Maria talked about the environmentalism and traditional Western notions of conservation and preservationist movements, right, that were very popular in the 19th century, they spread all through the world through globalization, right, and colonialism. They had this theory called cult of wilderness. We'll call it cult of wilderness. It's known as many things. But at the heart, the framing of this ideology that still is the bedrock foundation of many environmental, particularly conservation and preservationist groups, was this idea that there was a wilderness, a wild, pristine nature, separate and apart from humans, that needed protection, They needed to be set aside and defended as a pristine ecosystem. And it believed very much in the separation of people from those ecosystems, removing people like indigenous people, the workers of the land, campesinos, people who work the land, from that land. And they believed in natural resource management. In other words, the stewardship and management of those pristine ecosystems through the vigilance of people outside of those systems. So that's very much was the heart of conservation and preservation movements. Some people also say that it's also I won't get into all the different theories, the other underlying theories of the valuation that they have, but then they have the gospel of eco-efficiency. Sometimes people call this the ecological modernization theory, or eco-modernists. It's also known as sustainability, like the rise of sustainable development and sustainability, and the 3 E's. Many of my students come to me and they've learned, the 3 E's are equity, environment, and economy. And when the 3 E's come together, that's sustainable development, that's sustainability. And that really, the theory that underlines a lot of that is this idea of eco-efficiency, that that anything and everything can have a monetary valuation, right? So there's this commodification of ecosystems and the thinking of everything as a service. So it's very anthropomorphic, right? It's very anthropocentric, right? And it very much believes in sort of these win-win solutions, right? That innovation and technology and human capital can drive really rapid transitions that can sustain the current growth model of the economy, but do it in a way that is less materially intensive and fair and equitable and distributes goods to everyone while preserving the parts of the environment that we need. So it's like we see it reflected in a lot of sustainable development, smart growth, and it's really become the main way, the what I would say sort of the hegemonic discourse in environmentalism today. When people think about environmentalism, this is what they think about. They think about the 3 E's, they think about winning, win, win, win. And then there's what we would maybe call the mantra of environmental justice, or the folks that really their values and the ideologies focus around a right to livelihoods and cultural values that ties to place and to territory. They contest the capitalist mode of production, right? This is this treadmill of production and consumption that requires this growth model and the consumption and commodification of the world's ecosystems. And it places a value in oppositional tactics, right? And, you know, fights and resists land appropriation, real estate speculation, a lot of what we call false solutions. So I went through the mantra here, which is that EJ groups tend to, or the EJ theory, the sort of ideology behind it is very much tied to valuing culture and place and territory and people's connections and like to their livelihood and survival, but also to cultural cohesion. And there's a deep critique and contestation of capitalism, right? And the model of economic growth that keeps us on this treadmill of production and consumption and extraction. And so there's a critique of capitalism. There's also a valuing of resistance and oppositional tactics that push back against those modes of capitalism, and also of land appropriation and speculation. So there is a sort of more radical core to the ideology that sort of drives environmental justice activism and social movements. So yeah, very different and stark from the other sort of frameworks.
Would you say that the cult of wilderness is shifting and changing now with like decolonization and like colonialism being really brought to the forefront? Or I think about like where we are in the infrastructure plan a little bit, like, are we seeing like the gospel of eco-efficiency and environmental justice kind of be played against each other a little bit now with all the plans that are coming out at the federal level? I don't know, for you, Maria, too, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, because the cult of wilderness, I would say the preservationist and conservation movement has had a lot of reckoning to atone for, particularly in the global South, and the way that they moved and appropriated not just land here in the U.S. and in Europe, but all over the particularly in the global South. And there was a lot of resistance to that by indigenous groups and communities in the global South. Nevertheless, there's still a deep ideology of ecocentrism and Eurocentrism that's very deeply informed by colonialism that informs even today's version of preservation and conservation. And you'll see that there's still groups around the world that their mission is still centrally around the preservation of wilderness and ecosystems and specific species, for example. So there's still a deep ideological tie to that formation. Now, the gospel of equal efficiency, eco-modernism, sustainability, that language is so prevalent. It's so deeply, I would say, so dominant as a paradigm in today's thinking about environmentalism. And the EJ movement has very successfully tried to push back and reveal some of the contradictions of sustainability in the US and abroad. but I would say like the power of the seduction of sustainability around this idea of technological innovation and win-win solutions and not having to really change the model, puts environmental justice activism, like, how radical, how much of a critique is centered in the EJ pushback. So it's, you see like different strains of there's obviously different strains of environmentalism, eco-efficiency, and environmental justice movements too. There's different expressions of it as well. Like there's a continuum, I think, in terms of how radical, how critical, or how, yeah.
Anything you want to say, Maria? You think about it because you're in the middle of it happening right now at the White House, right?
Well, I would say that the cult of wilderness is very much alive. Isn't that really what I feel like? Cap and trade is a combination of both, right? Of cult of wilderness and eco efficiency. And then I guess reflecting on this, I'm stunned by how much, especially the folks that do like environmental justice and housing, a self-reflection for us, how much maybe we bought into the sustainable development and, using that language because it permeates everything we do, right? Like Anna said, that sometimes I think we can get caught up in the traps of these win-wins that continue the system to carry on. And I'm not sure, maybe that's a strategic decision because sometimes you can't win radical transformation of the system. You do have to meet it where it's at. But I wonder if people are aware that they're doing that, when they're doing like, certified buildings or we're promoting this. Like I know we have that at the preschool, right? Like it's for ICC, it's like a badge of honor for us. And it's near public transportation. I don't know. This is good to know, but I think they're very much alive. And the mantra of EJ, I don't know if it's like exactly winning. It's made its way into the mainstream, but I wonder if it's just being co-opted so that environmental justice actually mean these other things. And I've encountered that a lot. People think environmental justice is just justice for the environment, and it's pretty sickening.
I think about the role of the Conference of Parties and the UN and being able to like feed these different tributaries, if you will, into the way that we respond to climate, right? And in the kinds of national priorities that are put in place. But I know there's a couple other slides here I wanted to go through, and I'm just going to but maybe go through environmental racism. I do think there's so much to this diagram, even though it's not fully comprehensive, like you said, Anna, and it also is dated for when the moment was when this was created. But I think going back and trying to say, like, where are we actually? Where are some of the problems? Where are the nature of these problems embedded? Is it embedded in eco-efficiency, like Maria said, in the housing piece? Are they a response to the cult of wilderness and preservation? And how are we, in the way that we are moving the mantra of environmental justice, incorporating a different way of, in a different relationship with the earth and with each other in communities? So let me see, there's a couple of other slides here.
Yeah, there's all these theorists that thought of, folks have been talking about how to radicalize ecological modernization. Like, is it possible to actually, use technological innovation and advancements for a more radical critique and contestation of capitalism? So, that's a sort of an open question, right? It's not that EJ groups are anti-technology per se. It's like, how does that work, right? In service of what systems?
And whose technology, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And what do we mean by technology and innovation too? Because that's also like when we think about technology, advancement, modernity, we often have very Eurocentric views of what actually is advancement and what's considered technologically innovative.
Yeah, I see some of these slides here. It's like 12 and 13 talk about that. The modernization piece. So if people want to read more, I wanted to move us into maybe this piece around like slide 13, 14, where you're talking about, maybe slide 14, where you're actually talking about the pipelines.
Yeah, this comes from an article that Leah Temper did, I don't know, and her colleagues. Leah actually was one of the discussants on the radical reimaginations discussions we did. And so people can go back and listen to Leah talk a little bit more about her experience, but she tried to bring in even more dimensions of justice outside of sort of the Western notions of justice, like these Western theories of justice that we often think about: distributive, procedural, structural. Well, you know, Leah's like, okay, let's learn from indigenous communities about different forms of justice that surfaced in these resistance movements and the Wet'suwet'en First Nation resistance to the settler colonial pipeline developments, not just in their territories, but all throughout the pipeline area, and decolonizing sort of even our approach to defining environmental justice, right? And considering other forms of transformative justice, meaning what are the systems that are being transformed, right? So thinking about a self-governing authority versus a state versus people authority. We often think of a state-centered authority, us, them, our relationship to the state. And in many cases, in this pipeline case is a perfect example, is like where you're not looking or seeking for participation in, but freedom from, right? More relational ontologies, right? Like what is our relationship to nature? So positioning ourselves in terms of justice with and not justice for nature, right? And I think epistemic justice is like a fancy way of saying, like, how do we know, what's our system of knowing, our system of knowledge, right? When, you know, Indigenous communities go into a court in Canada and try to make a legal claim for their right to self-authority and autonomy. In many cases, when they're what they're talking about, the people in the court, the judge, has no way of understanding what they're talking. They don't have a framing for understanding their systems of knowledge and their systems of valuing. And so it's a form, there's a mismatch, there's an epistemic, the ways of knowing are different, and the ways of valuing are different. So how do you translate that in a court that many of those communities don't even recognize as having authority over them? So, you know, I think Leah does a really good job as trying to think, you know, how do we go beyond just participation, right? You know, Indigenous people, for example, may not be seeking participation, but sovereignty and self-governance. And how do we think about different radical traditions, right? Not just the left traditions we learned of in a European model or Eurocentric model, but like the rich Black radical tradition, right? Abolitionist theories, and even Black urban political ecology. So there's a lot of different struggles for freedom that are not looking for alleviation from the state, right? They're actually trying to break from the state. So this is a big question, right? Because not every group is in a position where they want, there are some folks who want to actually have a state-centered approach, right? They see the state as a central element of reformation and resistance, right? Like of taking over the state and having that as part of their liberation. And then other folks who say, no, we don't want anything to do with the state. The state will never, the state is part of racial capitalism. It's completely co-opted. We're never gonna find liberation if we try to work through the state. So there's this like, you know, push and pull around how do we, what are the alternatives, right? These are all different forms of alternative pathways for seeking out environmental justice broadly.
I think we struggled a little bit with that even when we started doing the fellowship of like, we know that the landscape assessment said people wanted to talk about just transition, and environmental justice was like the key component of like how people got into the movement. But with all the, like you said, all the different movements kind of becoming more radical, if you will, in the last couple of years since the landscape assessment, there was a better understanding of colonialism just in the time that the landscape assessment was made, you know, as a large part because of Standing Rock and because a lot of the indigenous movements becoming more powerful, and then the Black movement becoming more powerful. And so we struggled with like, are we only going to reference the just transition framework? Are we only going to reference the EJ principles and the 1991 summit? Or are we going to create space for libertary views and decolonization? And I think we landed on like what you're saying on is like, it isn't just one framework. It's important to be able to kind of keep pulling in and seeing ourselves as a larger, grander movement that's not so separate. I know, Maria, you talk about this a lot in some of the ways you express your way of being in environmental justice.
Yeah, I mean, because it's too complicated. It would be impossible if you're working on the ground to actually stick to a framework to say this is my liberatory stance. And like, I mean, you would be ridiculous, right? I think you have to bob and weave between different beliefs. I don't know that there's anybody who lives, well, maybe there are a lot of people sold on the system, but most people of color, I would say, don't believe that the state's going to give us any type of liberation. But the truth is, we exist within it. And I think a lot of, if you have a sober assessment of your own power, you're maybe not in the position to break free from the state completely at any given moment. You know, sometimes we need like a little relief. We need them to stop a permit. We need them to step in here, step in there, give us money. You know, like, I think that's a big contradiction in our movement too, is like a lot of organizers want to get paid for their time. And I don't know, when you're dealing in money, you're really depending on the state or state actors, right? Philanthropy, or otherwise. So I think these radical traditions, as radical as they are, I don't know. I see a lot of contradiction on the street, right? When it comes to folks wanting to get paid, folks wanting benefits, when we're talking about self-care. I don't know. It feels complicated, and I don't know if everyone's in the same position to try to reject the state. So, you know, what we hold at night versus what we hold during the day versus what makes sense to people on the ground that you're organizing, because they want to see relief immediately. So if you come to, you know, your base and you're like, we're going to break free from the state, you know, we're here in, like for us in Newark, right? We're going to break free from the state, but what does that actually translate to when people are like, I'm about to get evicted, I need a job, you know? So like, I think we have to be careful of what we hold to be true in our hearts, and then how we apply that on the street, especially if we want to get people to follow us. Because you're definitely not going to break free from the state with you. And like I like to say to my team, cuatro gatos, you know, it's not going to be you and four people. And if you want to do that, that's maybe you're moving out to a commune, you know, but if you're trying to break free with your whole community, I think that that requires us to take a little bit of everything and see different political contexts require different applications of all the things Anna's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe we go into the race, space, and EJ moment. Yeah.
Speaking of political processes, I mean, political context and matters deeply, and like we can do a whole other lecture on like different political systems and traditions too, that shape some of these theories and the application of these frameworks in different contexts around the world, because it implies different forms of governance for and different types of political organizing and agency. So, but here, right here, and these environmental racism slides are very much pinned to a US historical context. The racial histories of different parts of the world should look quite different, at least the evolution of those histories. But in the US, definitely the EJ movement has at its, you know, sort of conceptual framing around environmental racism in particular, and the key role that race plays and racialized dynamics play in the production of space and inequality in our communities. And many of these dynamics have been invisibilized, right? And buried, although I think there is a lot more attention to it now, thanks to Black Lives Matter and intersectionality and Black, critical race theory has really tried to surface these invisible histories of deeply entrenched racism in our society that you can see by the horrible opposition, this like very violent opposition to telling that history, to servicing that history, how important it is, right? The vehemency and the venom that has been thrown at it. So, but this is just like, this is our history. This is how places became like Newark and Detroit, and how these racialized spaces exist is not a coincidence. Back in the 1990s when we were all arguing, or we weren't, but like our predecessors in the 80s and 90s were arguing, having to make papers and do studies to show that environmental racism existed, that it was even a thing, because the academics and the state would say, no, there's a perfectly logical explanation why your community is being dumped on. First, it's personal choice. Like, you decided to live in this area. And so, sort of just like a market rational actor, right? You just like, you're a consumer, you went out in the marketplace, you decided to live here. It's a result of the free market, quote unquote, right? But if we unpack what is the free market, it's actually not free at all. The housing market and the land, market, real estate development is hyper racialized, right? It was, racial discrimination was codified into law, right? So where you lived and what color you were very much tied together. So this is sort of breaks down the history of that and how white supremacy spread from the Jim Crow South through things like racial covenants in housing, right? When you would go to sell your house, you could say, you can't sell this house to a Black person. In mortgage lending, the most insidious things were that the federal government wrote into law you could not lend to entire classes of people, Black people, right? They would then insert that into the private real estate market. So home lending agencies and real estate agencies would actually line out the areas that were classified as blighted or not suitable for lending. So you couldn't get a home loan in those areas. Many communities were developed that completely zoned out Black people. You couldn't live in particular areas if you were Black. You couldn't buy a home there, you couldn't rent a home there. So this was written into our federal laws, into our state laws, and even into our local municipal ordinances. Well into the 1930s and 40s, some of those laws still exist. They were successively, with court cases, racists got smarter, or at least more subtle. And so instead of using race, when the use of race was banned from being used post 1960s, they just started to use class, right? They started to use income. So instead of out saying race, you can't live here if you're Black, they would zone out of land use, multifamily dwellings, affordable housing. They'd only do, for example, something like 1 acre lots with single family homes that only millionaires could afford, and then they would exclude, obviously this plays in with the economic and employment market, right? So it wasn't just the housing discrimination was happening, industrial zoning was happening at the same time, right? White flight from cities, deindustrialization, all these systems were happening at the same time, right? Where you had deindustrialization, the flight of whites to the suburbs, the cordoning off of white suburbs by law from people of color. So you're creating these concentrated pockets of people who you're discriminating against in employment practices, discriminating against in housing practices. And then you're zoning all the things that nobody wants in the suburbs, exclusively into the areas that have now experienced deindustrialization and white flight. So it's a perfect mix for how we get to sacrifice zones, right? And at the end, they'll tell you, well, this was the free market, right? The real estate is cheaper in Newark. Well, why is the real estate cheaper in Newark? How has land become devalued and segregated? So all of this is to think about when we think about environmental racism and the spaces, the built environment, we have to think of them relationally, right? We have to think of places like Newark can't exist without places that are extremely white and wealthy, right? Those things exist in relationship to each other. They were created as part of this larger system of racialized space. And it's part of the perpetuation of white supremacy, right? That holds this system together and perpetuates it. So racism is structural, right? It's embedded in the institutions of our society. It's dynamic, so it creates these different relationships between spaces. And it takes out of the picture this idea, people think of racism in very narrow terms, right? Of individual actors or decisions, but it's actually, it doesn't, the intentionality and the motivation behind racism doesn't really matter, right? And actually, racism thrives in a society that considers itself colorblind, right? Race neutrality entrenches racism because it doesn't recognize those racial dynamics and try to affirmatively counteract them, right? If you can't see those racialized systemic systems, then you're not going to address them. You're just going to continue to permit facilities in the same communities because you'll say, well, the state says, well, we don't consider race. We don't consider where you're citing it. We just consider the facility and where it shows up, where the private market decides to put it. So it doesn't.
And can you bring us back to like the environmental movement? Like, how does environmental racism sit within environmental justice and the environmental movement? I think there's something you're saying in this last statement of like negating that race is an issue that fermented in the environmental movement for a long time, leading to the 1991 summit.
Yeah, I mean, it's deeply implicated in that process, right? That racialization, because as white communities fled to the suburbs and started to see their environment as spaces of pristine areas of protection, they zoned out everything they didn't want. And by doing that, they effectively said, our spaces, white spaces, are worthy of protection. And didn't consider the fact that like, oh, but I still want my garbage to go somewhere. I still want, my Amazon package to come on time. Where's that gonna go? Well, not here, not the community I'm living in and protecting. So I think environmentalism with absent like a racial, an understanding of racial dynamics and how racism permeates our society and our built environment just feeds that, right? It feeds that system because it doesn't challenge the underlying notion that these spaces are connected to one another, right? So just saying, oh, let's do standard environmental reformism, right? Standard environmental protection practices that don't affirmatively deal with that racial history is just entrenching those systems.
I think it's been interesting. I was at a meeting recently where people are talking about environmental justice, but they didn't want to talk about race. They didn't want to talk about racism. And I'm like, then you don't understand why you're here. Like you shouldn't be in this room. You should probably be in a conservation space. They were like, let's just leave race out of it. We're making it more complicated. And I think that somehow, our movement, I think I understand why we started saying environmental justice, right? Be proactive. The world we want to see is environmental justice, but if we don't keep saying racism, all of this happens because of racism. I think there's a big loss there, and that's how the mainstream environmental movement is seeking to co-opt environmental justice, right? To erase racism from that movement, I think is what allows it to happen. Because obviously when I'm hearing all this, like the scale things, sacrifice zones, it's obvious when you're in our communities that, you know, the garbage incinerator is not meant for this small community. It's meant to serve so many other people that don't live here. You know, like when you see those giant, like the economies of scale, of it's just cheaper to do it that way, to, you know, concentrate things to make them bigger and better so that they serve more people. And it's for the greater good. That way you don't have 10 incinerators in every single community. You just have one really large one in a Black and brown community, you know? So I think you can see this on the ground, but we need to be mindful of how we talk about it and always keeping racism front and center.
Yeah, definitely. And like the idea that the discussion of race is really uncomfortable and inconvenient for people is precisely, you know, the thing that keeps, you know, racism alive and well. Like my students always want to talk about class. Oh, it's income, it's income. It's really important that they, you know, recognize that income alone does not explain the dynamics we have. Yeah.
No, I think that's the transition, right? That in order to justify the white environmental or the colonial environmental approach, there is a number, or what you've said, what we learned here, which was the eco-efficiency approach. There's developed a number of false solutions. And I think we've done, as a movement, tried to really understand them. They're very technocratic. They're meant to be confusing and divisive, and they often pin communities against solutions that seem reasonable when in fact they're false, incremental, and sometimes even harmful.
Well,
Yeah.
can I say false solutions? You know, I have been realizing that our language isn't catching. So just putting it out there is something for the fellowship to work on, because false solutions, like, what the hell is that? You sound a little out there, you know, false and solution. Like, I've been saying counterproductive measures, right? But like, that's not sexy. And maybe that's how it gets through, but just putting it out there.
I've been saying harmful solutions more often, even deadly solutions. I don't know.
You're still
Ana,
conceding solutions, but
what's
Yeah, I
been
think the
the
solutions
Oh.
part is the problem. I think we need to think of it as like, you know, this is old news repackaged. Yeah, we definitely need to figure out a way to change this idea, this notion that it's a solution. It's actually like the same thing. It's actually just the same old thing. It's like what we have now. Maybe it's business as usual, you know, repackaged. But yeah, I mean, the false solutions, you know, this is an area of work that the grassroots EJ movement around the world really led to, really and blew open, you know, with the involvement, particularly in exposing the greenwashing that was happening in the UN climate talks, the international talks, where there was all these proposals from the global north and from industries, particularly fossil fuel industries. So whenever you have powerful corporations interested in getting together and coming up with quote unquote solutions, you should be suspicious. But you know, luckily the groups on the ground really pushed back when the climate talk started to focus in on you know, the RED program, right? This deforestation program that was developed, and the clean development mechanism that was developed around carbon trading schemes that would basically do this huge amount of land grabbing in the global south to use it as a sink for the continuation of the system of, you know, basically climate change, right? You know, you still produce a lot of carbon intensive industries can continue to operate as long as they sink it in the global south. And it was also very much a way to put in place a commodification, market mechanism in place of, before the Clean Development Mechanism, what was being discussed and negotiated at the UN climate talks, although in lots of very weak forms, was actually shifting these industries, right? Mitigating, regulating them, intervening to stop the continuation of climate-inducing technologies and shifting to alternatives. And instead, there was this introduction of what was considered a sustainable solution, right? Sort of a win-win, where we can account for, on paper, we can go, buy land and do, monocrops, monocrop plantation, tree plantations, or, just pay people or pay governments to supposedly sink these emissions. So this was the impetus for this rapid rise, because it got so much traction at the UN, it quickly took off and became the dominant paradigm, really. It was this pivotal moment where almost everything that was being proposed for climate mitigation, a lot of it was centered around these technological innovations, right? And these market trading schemes. So there were no longer a lot of emphasis on regulatory mandates, state-centered mandates to industries to intervene on industries, which is sort of the standard form of environmentalism where the state intervenes. But instead there was all these market mechanisms. So let the market send a signal to the industries to reduce emissions. And the problem with this, if you come from a radical tradition of environmental justice movements, is that it doesn't get to the core, the root, the cause of what's driving climate change, which in many cases is capitalism, right? It's this economic growth model that requires very extractive industries to continue to live. And that even if you introduce this ecological modernization theory, this eco-efficiency theory, where you're like, okay, we'll come on the back end and create a sink or a technological innovation that scrubs the air or in a more efficient way to produce natural gas, it's still driving the same system forward of extraction. And often the communities and the types of issues that get left behind or marginalized or trampled on are things like sovereignty, cultural rights, human rights, the concentration of pollution and extractive things in the EJ communities, right? At the points of extraction, at the points of production and transport. So you still retain all the basic infrastructure of environmental racism and environmental injustice. You just do it in a more technologically advanced manner. With the same systems actors. So one of the main critiques of false solutions is that it doesn't consider other values or other framings of justice, right? Not even just distributive justice, but other forms of justice, like the relational forms or transformative forms of justice or cultural recognition forms of justice. It also centers the control and commodification of energy systems, right? So the same industry elites that control the fossil fuel extractive industries are controlling the technological innovations. So that's the other part of, like, if you want to know if it's a false solution, who's driving the innovation? Who controls that system and that transition? And who gets to govern it? Who gets to sway in and decide on who's benefiting from that system? And then, of course, there's all these like solutions, technologies that are framed as shortcuts or solutions or silver bullets, so to speak, but actually have all these like consequences, both pollution, distributive problems, right? At the points of extraction are communities that are getting marginalized or also polluted on or dumped on. So there's all these problems with the technologies themselves sometimes. Yeah.
Now, if you go to the conference of parties now, it's like a trade show. You go and industry has a whole.
It's been completely, it's been completely shifted to this model of market mechanisms. I joke with the environmentalists sometimes, like, remember the good old days we used to like regulate people and like want the state to intervene on, to stop industries, like limit the power of these industries. Now it's like, it's totally open season, right? Like they get to control.
I would say for folks here, right, in the US, because I think sometimes I don't know. I could be misspeaking here, but one of the reasons I find that people don't engage sometimes on the false solutions, and I'm talking about people maybe in the urban centers or rural communities where it's not no one's grabbing our land, right? So it's hard, I think, sometimes to see why carbon trading matters to us. So I do think that it's important to understand that when our governments pursue these carbon trading, these technologies, it's an opportunity cost. The more that they think that we can capture emissions from the air, the less political energy there is towards the solution you want, because I will say I had to convince some of my colleagues to join us when we were fighting some cap and trade things up here in the Northeast, because it seems almost irrelevant to the work, right? Like, well, that's not our issue. It's happening over there. But anything that's happening over there, I would say that there's a limited amount of political capital to be spent on any given issue. So if your issue is climate change or emissions reduction, and you see your politicians spending political capital on something that is actually relevant to you, that's not your fight, but it is, because that's political capital being stolen from your possible path forward, right? And I think we do need to understand that we can't ignore things, because I think, I mean, I hear it all the time in our movement. Oh, well, we don't have the energy. We can't fight all the fights. I do think we need, it's almost like money, all the money is being spent over here, then there's no money left for you. And I know that that's scarcity, but it is, if we are fighting in that framework, any political energy spent here is not spent for you. And that's why you should fight false solutions, even if you think they're not stealing your land and these technologies are not happening in your backyard. Not yet. They'll be blowing up something in your backyard soon enough, so I think it's also that it's easier to stop it now than wait till it gets to the heart of Boston before you actually engage, and I think that's where we've been successful in the Northeast, to like band together and fight these things off before they took hold.
Yeah.
I like carbon capture sequestration though, because that finally hit a lot of communities here that had coal plants in a different way that some of the other technologies like the solar radiation, that's also happening in indigenous communities. But when we try to talk about carbon capture sequestration to people at the very beginning, I mean, even the words, like, what does that even mean? The storage element of it. And so we started breaking it down using Hoodwinked. We used the carbon pricing booklet that was developed with IEN, and a lot of folks, like Anna said, that had been at the COPs and understood these mechanisms and these schemes for many, many years. But I think carbon capture, sequestration, and storage really hit folks in a different way.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think CCS now is being used as like, I've heard different framings of it where it's like, this is inevitable. You're going to get this. This is just the tip of the iceberg, really. So let's make it as palatable as possible, recognizing that it's not what EJ communities would want. It's sort of what was the same framing of natural gas as a bridge fuel, back in the early 2000s, right? That, it's not what you want, but it's coming. And so you get ready for it. The problem with so much of this is that the other part of it is not just political opportunity cost, but it's stranded assets. It's like locking in a particular path. That's
for
hard.
years.
Yes, it's hard to get out of. And where we are currently in this process, it's like these types of entrenchments will make the difference as to where we're headed, right? For the next 20, 30 years. So it can potentially keep in place the very industries we're supposedly trying to get off of very quickly. So it just like locks them in for longer. So if you've got like a natural gas plant in your EJ community now, these carbon trading schemes that are far off or somewhere else are being negotiated, actually are helping to like ensure that those companies can stay for a lot longer than they might have otherwise. So yeah.
When I look at some of the numbers here on the slide, the examples of false solutions with the carbon capture sequestration, like you look at these millions and billions of dollars, and yet there isn't enough money to, have some of the simple stuff that comes out in some of the just transition plans that local communities put forth is like essential to making a transition.
Yeah, I mean, and these are investments from the IIJ that have been approved. They will happen. So these are not just like theoretical pots of money. This is money that is going out the door, is already going, or has been already out the door. And the most insidious parts of this funding are actually the tax credits that stay around for a long time. Even after this particular infusion of money gets put out, they'll still remain for many years to come, these tax credits that the industries can use to basically prop up a part of the industry that's actually not viable on its own. This is the interesting part of it about many of these technologies like hydrogen and nuclear and some of these things that are being proposed as solutions on their own in the private. These are people who believe in the free market, right? But on their own, these things would go nowhere. They are, this federal government is infusing this capital into this to try to prop up this industry. They could use the same catalytic investments in different pathways. And reformists will tell you, oh, well, we have to put money in all of these technologies and maybe one of them will take off. But if you're looking for just sort of a radical transformation of the system, you wouldn't necessarily do it this way, right? So you would try to find alternatives that would you could entrench and actually get off of the same industry groups that are running it. So this is all to say that it's a very interesting pivotal time for the EJ movement because we're at a particular moment of turning point. Just like in the early 2000s, we were shifting to natural gas. There was this promise of a potential, climate bill that never happened. Here we are in another different political moment. The climate crisis is becoming ever more urgent. And so the solutions are getting more and more desperate, and the industries that are propping them up are getting more and more creative, I would say. And the technological complexity of some of these technologies also helps to keep us in the dark, right? Keeps movements, the rapid nature of the technological transformation and the complexity of it is also a way to obfuscate, right? And to keep people confused and they're not sure what their target is. And you can spend all your time just fighting each one of these things as they come up. So it's a big question for how you take on this package of false solutions, right? As a block.
Because these are all being proposed as climate solutions.
Yes.
All climate solutions. And so maybe we're going to the climate justice, because so we're transitioning, right? So it's like, how did the movement change? Okay, it's environmental justice, but at its core, it's environmental justice, but then there's these moments, right? And so climate justice was a moment that is responding and in and of itself, incorporating environmental justice as its premise for fighting these solutions, but also building the new. I think we're trying to get to that just transition pace where Jesus and I take on video too.
Yes, you guys can take it on. Yeah, and just like how defining environmental justice is difficult, defining climate justice, I think, is equally difficult to articulate elegantly. And we know what it's not, what climate injustice is, what it looks like. But trying to define, what does climate justice mean? And I have to say, if we think EJ is co-opted, climate justice is even more co-opted, because I see everybody has a climate justice landing page, every corporation, company.
Well, it's so seductive, climate justice. The idea that climate change impacts everybody, I feel like that's, very attractive. Oh my God, we're all going to be impacted by this. And that, but not the same way. It's key and just gets disappeared. I even have this fight in New Jersey all the time with the folks from the shore because they're like, we're gonna flood. I'm like, yeah, we flood already, and it's toxic floods. It's not just like water; it's like hazardous waste that's coming into people's basements, and that kids have to wade through sewage water. So this idea, and this is in the U.S. That's like the privileged version of climate change possibilities. We're not even thinking about places that are going to completely disappear in other parts of the world. So yeah, no, I agree with you. Climate justice has been completely co-opted. I really wonder about it.
Yeah, and this notion that justice connotes something owed, right? This idea of reparations and damages, like the people who are currently suffering the consequences of something are not the people who are responsible for doing it. And so the people who are responsible for doing it owe something to those communities.
Those are the people wearing it on a t-shirt though. And
Right.
they got their mug from Sierra Club,
So yeah, this is the part that's messy, like even in international talks, and like who gets to speak for what is owed and what is due, right? And what's the responsibility in relationships. But to me, it's like there's all these things that are implicated, root causes, right? The participatory democracy, what is also the systems of governance that govern this underlying form of justice? How do you deliver this justice? Who gets to say? Anyway, so there's some really good ideas around what is the basis of justice? What's the form of justice that gets rooted in the solutions and in the practices? And what's the systemic transformation that's tackling the root cause of climate change? Like, do you believe climate change is tied to and formative of inequality and racism, right? This is I think the key marker of whether you actually think about climate justice as climate change or climate justice.
Mhm.
If you think climate change is an ecological, problem, right? It's a problem of climate, carbon molecules and how to reduce them in the atmosphere, and completely divorced from any notion of how that's tied to systems that reproduce inequality and ecological destruction, then you don't really believe in climate justice. Those two things have to be linked up together because it's the same systems that are driving those. But some people don't believe that, right? Some people believe that the climate crisis is simply a crisis of a marketplace, like it's an economic issue or, sort of an ecological problem that can be fixed by an economic solution. So yeah. Yeah, and I guess we'll end here, right? Let's just transition. So this is from an old paper by Stephen Tufts, but I thought, bring it out. I always like a little simple chart. This is very oversimplified, especially since 2011, where the landscape around just transition has evolved quite a bit. And now like several national governments, even like the EU, a lot of people have just transition platforms and programs, nation state programs around just transition that they've defined. But theoretically speaking, like these different notions of just transition can take various different forms. One version that we hear a lot, particularly in the US, is this idea of green capitalism. So basically we can transition to a carbon-free economy driven by the free market, right? That under capitalism, we can efficiently find and reward green innovation, right? Like renewable energy technologies that can be deployed. And we can do this, the most effective and efficient way to do that is actually doing it through capitalism, getting it into the marketplace, making solar panels competitive on the market with other energy sources. So that's like a form of transition that keeps the same economic system intact. Then there's just like the state-centered approach, and the EU has gone really all in on this Green New Deal approach, the state-centered approach, where you have a sort of more top-down transition driven by, sort of a hybrid of state corporate actors. So the state plays a very central role in this. They infuse a lot of capital along with private actors into mega projects, like major infrastructure projects that can drive a lot of transition through like job creation, job transformation, right? Workplace transformation. But in this state-centered approach of the Green New Deal, there's a lot of threats of like low-wage jobs, like, there's a lot of potential like watering down of solidarity with workers and the meaning of work and the quality of work, right? It's sort of a gig economy model. So there's that. So there's lots of different versions of the Green New Deal, a just transition, like how central is the state as an actor in driving those investments with or without private actors? What's the scale of the projects? I've talked to a lot of people who are like, oh, we're never going to get the decarbonization without like massive state investment backed by private actors and labor unions. Like we need mega projects all over the world, like if we want to implement this. And then you have like this, what he calls organic energy democracy. I think it's more like sort of a more like just, you know, what I would call like a EJ version of just transition, right? Which is much more decentralized, much more direct democratic control over energy systems, that there's a lot more emphasis on decentralized versions of and a descaling of energy systems from a centralized model, and some trans local solidarity that has to happen to make it work, right? So you have to prioritize building those relationships between decentralized communities across the globe. And then there's just green capitalism, which is like green capitalism, only like more justice sprinkled in. So in this case, you have more market regulation to require that there's some redistribution of the transition to green capitalism. So this is where like carbon taxes come in, right? Like you can regulate the green market and then like use the investments from that to like distribute in a progressive way. So that's just green capitalism. Anyway, very simplified, very simplified.
It feels like it's not like at any historical moment you're just experiencing one of those boxes. It's like you could see multiple like interpretations of those boxes playing out in the way that even the infrastructure plan is being proposed right now, or Justice 40 is being developed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is the place where we're gonna stop on this one. Thank you so much. You've covered so much, and it's been helpful to have a conversation about it. I probably could stay on for another hour just discussing each part of these slides. And part of our goal with the fellowship is just to have a place to be able to talk about that history, contemplate it, see how we can develop new ways of creative disruption, recognizing that the work we're doing together is not about just fixing parts of the extractive economy or the system, but it's really an opportunity for us to spend 2 years moving into a real disruption or systemic change that's going to have impact. So Jesus and I are picking up on this just transition framework and a little bit of history of that on our second video. Okay. And we're encouraging folks in the fellowship, Maria, your group, and Jesus's group and other groups, to just start to really look at the problem and reflect on these 2 videos to see where the source of the problem lives. Where was it created? Where does it still live right now? And how, as we start moving into phase 2, the solutions can start living more in this regenerative economy model, or a different colonial model, a liberatory model that maybe even exceeds what you're seeing on this framework. So with that, just opening up for any closing thoughts on the process, any love for Miami as we're moving into Miami in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I just full disclosure. I just want you to put like a little disclosure at the beginning. These slides are up for debate, contestation, and free interpretation and adding. So these are just meant as like a jumping off point for reflection and critique. This is all based on literature, so it's not the sort of grounded lived experience of people grappling with the practical realities of theory and practice. So I think that's the most important thing, is people really taking to heart that there's an opportunity here for like reflection and like positioning and thinking about like, you know, where you see yourself and where, you know, you see the context currently. You know, sometimes it's like a lot of noise and you're so deeply in it that it's hard to like pull your head up and kind of like get some perspective on like, where are we? So hopefully this is like a luxury, like a moment to kind of like step back and like have a little bit of time to think about those things. I hope that's like an invitation, and I'm looking forward to Miami, where people are coming in with like a lot of energy around the ideas.
Yeah, I struggle a lot with the academia. But I think it's important for those of us on the ground to understand all these theories, because there are people being like born and raised in them now. People are going to school studying environmental justice movements. And you know, I struggle with that because none of these theories are clean. They are pretending to have categorized something that is lived through observation and viewing, you know, like, but they're not the object that is observed, right? Like they're not the people living it and experiencing it, feeling it, breathing it. So I think it's important for us to understand these things. Just like any theory, you can't live in one of them. And I know I hear people in the movement say all the time, oh, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, but you better damn know them, you know, like you better know what they do, what these tools do, how they might be used against you, you know, like I know my mom says in Honduras, they actually say you use the master's tools to burn down his house, you know, you use everything you got to use the resources at your disposal. And I say both those things just to say, don't get stuck on anything, right? And I say I won't get stuck on a phrase, on a fucking hashtag, on a catchphrase as the way to do business. And I say this all the time, we learn to negotiate from cartoons. Like there are, you know, just double or nothing. We're not gambling here. And I think if our movement's going to grow and get more sophisticated, we better spend some time studying a little bit, so that our application on the ground can be that much better. You know, so I don't like academic study, but I don't reject it wholesale, because I think it's important if we're going to get sophisticated and if we're going to grow, we need to push ourselves beyond our comfort zones.
I appreciate all of those perspectives and more to come. And so thank you for all of the time. I know this became a much richer conversation than you signed up for. And yeah, we continue focusing on, I think, Maria, you say it very well, the material conditions on the ground. Like, how can this benefit what comes out at the end of these 2 years and the change in material conditions on the ground? Thank you so much. Have a beautiful week. Bye-bye.